Host of today's show. Ask an Archaeologist is a series of live-streamed interviews co-hosted by the Archaeological Research Facility and the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology at UC Berkeley for Cal Week 2020. Each day at 11 and 2, we will interview a UC Berkeley archaeologist and answer audience questions. If you have questions to ask, please go to slido or sli.do/askarf, one word, ASKARF, and click join, and you can type your question there. We will remind you of this partway through the interview. So today, I have the pleasure of interviewing Professor Michael Nylan on the subject of Chang'an, counterpart to Rome and Alexandria. Professor Nylan teaches in the history department at UC Berkeley. She writes on three main academic disciplines: the history of early China, early Chinese philosophy, and the art and archaeology of China. So Professor Nylan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I'm also just working a lot on urban archaeology, and for people who have questions about modern or late urban archaeology, I can entertain those later. But let me move on to the main area of my work, and that is the Han Dynasty capital of Chang'an in the first 2 centuries BC. Many people know about Rome. Lots of people have visited it. Very few people know much about this capital. And that's where archaeology comes in. And I will explain eventually. The Chang'an, though so few people know it, was 3 times the size of Rome, nearly 4 times the size of Alexandria, and it was 17 times the size of Byzantium in the early world. It ruled over an empire that was comparable to that of Rome. Both of them had about 60 million registered taxpayers, and the territory at their largest extent was approximately the same as well. So what we're talking about is the counterpart to Rome that, like Rome, controls 1/4 of the world's population. That's a pretty stunning figure.
Amazing.
And more people should know about it. Many people know something that happened nearby Chang'an, not much before. And that was, many people know the terracotta warriors, these 6,000 to 7,000 life-size figures that were buried underground as a kind of army to protect the first emperor of the previous dynasty, which only lasted 11 years. So we're not talking about a huge gap in time here. Chang'an was actually built on the palace foundations that were to be built, according to the first emperor of Qin's plans, out of rammed earth south of the Wei River. The capital for the first emperor was north of that river. And what we're talking about is a site of immense size, much bigger than Shenyang, and surrounded by a park, an imperial park that in its east-west dimensions was 103 miles large. Wow. Yeah, I know, just kind of wow. So obviously the size of the city is the first thing that smacks us, both the population and just the size of greater metropolitan Chang'an. But if you visited the city, it would have been the density of walled structures but within the city walls. Shenyang was not walled, and that's very interesting. The previous capital had not been walled, but this capital was walls within walls within walls within walls. And what you would also have been struck with is that in any given time in the city, and there were 3 stages of building, over 1/2, and sometimes estimated as much as 3/4 of the cities would have been palace structures. Now those palace structures contain dormitories and residence halls for officials, but looked at from the outside, we just see palace, 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 palace. So when I'm thinking about comparing Rome and China, and I do a lot of cross-cultural comparisons, what I think of is both of them were famous for two urban amenities that we in the modern period just take totally for granted. One is paved roads, and the second one was water features, plenty of water all over the city. And as we'll see later with a slideshow, pipes bringing in fresh water to the palace structures, at least the affluent had sewage pipes versus freshwater pipes coming in. That's pretty amazing for the early world.
That's right. Is this, can I ask, is this roughly contemporaneous with Rome or slightly earlier?
Yes, it's exactly contemporaneous. I called my book Chang'an 26 BCE because Augustus began in 27 BC. So we're talking exactly comparable sites. Thanks for asking. Rome would have looked totally different because they learned how to build in cement very early on in Rome. And so they had tenement buildings that were 5 to 6 stories tall. Han, they built because there's a paucity of stone in the North China Plain because of glacial activity. There is instead this incredibly fine soil, and there is timber. So they made the city primarily out of modular units, incredibly efficient use of timber at the time. But with timber, you can't build multi-story projects. So what they had for these palatial scenes, and I'll show you one when I share the screen on my PowerPoint, was they had a they had an earthen core into which beams were fitted. And that held up what appeared to be multi-story structures. So not the poor, but the absolute creme de la creme, the imperial family was living in multi-storied structures. Now, Rome ran on a completely different basis. It was a slave economy. Up to 40% of the population of Rome were slaves, freed or still in service. In Han Chang'an, we probably have less than 1%. These were typically conquered people who were brought in to be domestic help, to dress hair, to be entertainers on flutes, that kind of thing. And the one other big difference, which would have smacked anybody right away, was in Rome, at the time of Augustus, there were exactly 0 paid administrators. In the Han Empire, there were 130,000 paid administrators, each with staffs of 5 to 10 on average, meaning, and 30,000 of these were living permanently in the capital. The others were traveling back and forth to the capital to get their assignments. So lots of activity going back and forth. So I want to leave Rome and China for the minute and go to the Great Library, because everybody thinks they know about the Great Library in Alexandria. Well, archaeologists know something quite a bit different than what everybody thinks they know. The Great Library was built in the mid-3rd century BC by the Ptolemies. Ptolemy II started it, and it was a minor room, and archaeologists have confirmed this, in what was called the museum. And this was a place where you just kept expensive tchotchke that had been brought by foreign visitors and diplomatic guests. And in turn, you would show it off to foreign visitors and diplomatic guests, would-be allies. And so we're talking about a very small space. And this was confirmed when we look at the pinaques by Callimachus, a Roman poet. He lists 120 papyrus scrolls. Now, even if he was a literary figure and poet, even if he's only listing the scrolls that were of interest to him, there is no way that this space could have held more than 30 experts at a single time, crammed together, possibly looking at a couple of hundred scrolls. By contrast, the library that nobody knows anything about, that in Han Chang'an, we have the library catalog there. And we also have, in many cases, the detailed notes of the Han Dynasty librarian who happened to be a member of the imperial family. We have 13,296 scrolls in that library, and we know it was only a very small part of the imperial holdings. This was a part of the library in which 30 to 50 officials could be working at any given time. So we have a supposedly great library in Alexandria, and of course the modern story is they've tried to rebuild a great library in that place. No one knows about this incredible library project that took place over 20 years from 26 BC to 6 BC in Han China. But that catalog becomes the basis in every other dynastic history. We have library catalogs. And so this becomes something that we know about and is maybe just taken for granted by Chinese scholars.
What condition is the archaeological site of the library in today?
Well, the trouble with the site in Han Chang'an is it's in a well-plowed field. We know exactly where it is because we can see the earthen core for the library. And so we have something, a marker on top of it. And besides, we have such good records about this whole endeavor that we would have been able to locate it without the rammed earth core. What rammed earth does is recompact very loose soil so that it becomes virtually stone again. And so that's why we've got this and we've got that. So if I may, I'm gonna share my screen and just show you a tiny bit of the kind of things I look at all the time. Just because I think it will be interesting. Okay. What you're seeing on screen is what got me interested in Han Dynasty. And I'm cheating because this wasn't in Chang'an, although it may well have been produced in the imperial workshops in Han Chang'an, given the luxury of the site. What we found and what was well publicized in the early 1970s after China's archaeological establishment restarted itself after the Mao's Cultural Revolution was this incredible banner which shows at the very bottom the corpse of the tomb occupant, Lady Dai, pronounced D-A-I or spelled D-A-I, and her apotheosis, her becoming a god between the sun and the moon at the very top of the banner. And to your right, what you're seeing is the tomb structure itself. It was a bunch of nested coffins, and in each one of those spaces, it was crammed full of luxury items. And those luxury items included everything from lots of lacquerware to expensive medicines to many, many manuscripts. And so this is one of the ways I became interested in focusing on the Han Dynasty, the time I said I was going to work on the Han Dynasty in America, there was no way to study that. There was no early China here. And so it was a major, I never thought I'd get a job, but that's another case. So here's some palaces. This is what the palaces would have looked like based on archaeological reconstructions. We know a lot more about the Roman one in the upper right because parts of it still exist today in Rome, being built out of stone. But the way we can reconstruct architecture in China is through post holes. Those tell us how big the bays were between the pillars, and we can tell quite a lot from those post holes. They don't look like much, but we know what we're doing.
Well, you mentioned it's adjacent to the river, the Wei River. Is there a problem with flooding?
Only once, but that was a terrible problem. And the water was coming up to the earthen walls, the top of them, and people were really terrified in that one really bad flooding. The Wei River was tamed, as it were, by building lots of feeder canals off of it that were useful for feeding the city with water and grain. And so it was relatively okay. It wasn't like the Yellow River further south, which would have experienced everything in that floodplain, has experienced flood after flood after flood. So the real problem in Chang'an, because of the wooden architecture, was fire. And part of this city was razed in the downfall of Western Han when some bandits were looting and were careless and set some things on fire. And so we have the markings of that fire in the archaeological record. This is down below what it would have looked like to someone who was traveling through the city. There were in these corridors between these major walled enclosures. That actually, that chariot has been done quite faithfully to Han Dynasty depictions of the events. So we can take a look here at just the situation of the Han Chang'an. As you'll see, a river called Jue or Xue in the northwest corner takes off some of that water from the Wei River, even though the ancient Wei River was considerably closer to Western Han Chang'an than today's. And you'll see that surrounded by Chang'an, it is surrounded by granaries. And the other thing you can see in the picture on the left is look at modern day Qian and how tiny it is compared to Han Chang'an. So a lot of these canals were built over time because they needed to get more and more fresh water and grain into the city. So we're looking at a point in 26 BCE where we know what it looked like. On the lower right, there's a blue arrow where Chang'an is. And this is how far you have to go out with your silk and your lacquers to Dunhuang, which is where Central Asia begins. And so basically take a look at that. Why was it worth it to do that? It was worth it because at that time period, Western Han Chang'an was the only place in the world that produced silk and lacquer. And we all know about silk and how much Roman elites like to dress in silk and how much silver was drained from the Roman economy because of that. Most of us don't think about lacquers, but they are the plastics of the early world. They were very valuable because they're beautiful to behold. But unlike metal containers or pottery containers, they don't tend to leak. And so they're beautiful to behold, but they also hold water, wine, soups, all of this very, very well. So this was the dinnerware you wanted to have if you could afford it anywhere. And we see that in tombs.
Great. Well, if I can take a moment to remind our listeners that if you'd like to pose a question to Professor Nylan, you can go to the webpage Slido, sli.do, and type in Ask ARF and click Join, and there you can submit questions. So thank you. Continue.
Okay, I just thought I'd show you two of the luxury items we've found in tombs in Chang'an. And the one on the left is gold. Gold is valued, but not superbly valued supremely above silver at the time. But this vessel is really quite large, probably 2 feet tall. I'm trying to remember, but really an impressively sized vessel. And all of those tongues are inscribed with auspicious sayings. Okay. And to the right, I have a typical lacquer, only atypical in the sense that it was so beautifully preserved in a given tomb that practically no restoration work had to be done on it whatsoever. But when we're talking about the major tomb sites, we can have hundreds, even thousands of these vessels crammed into the tomb sites, clearly supposed to signify to the afterlife the preeminence of the tomb occupants.
I see. Oh, well, we have a question here about luxury goods.
Sure.
You mentioned this is the eastern end of the Silk Road.
Yes.
And the question is, how did they transport luxury goods over long distances, and was it safe?
Okay. No more safe than in the modern world. If something is of extremely high value, there will be people who are trying to get at it. The typical way that goods were protected across the Silk Road was that they would be loaded onto camels and put in caravans that would then be armed. Now, one reason the Han Wudi, who ruled from 141 to 87 BC, made alliances and actually went out and conquered many of the states in what we would now call Xinjiang, Central Asia, was to protect those caravans. He simply couldn't get the luxury goods he wanted back and the silver from places as far distant as Rome without protection for those caravans. So after Han Wudi died, and he had an enormously the longest reign of all of the emperors in the two Han dynasties, many people began to argue, isn't there a more cost-effective way than conquest to get those caravans protected? And often there was by giving powers and privileges to the Central Asian kings that would help them keep hold of their legitimacy. But in Central Asia, at the time when all this Silk Road activity begins, there are 37 separate kingdoms there. And so keeping control of all of those kingdoms was enormously expensive for the Han dynasty. And after Han Wudi died, that's when conversations start to happen. Isn't there a better way than just conquest? Central Asia.
I see.
So anyway, I hope that helps. Yeah. If you looked on Google images today for what the Great Wall looks like, it's pretty pathetic. It looks like what we're seeing on screen.
The Great Wall of China.
The Great Wall of China. It's of course a series of earthen mounds that don't seem to be connected, that kind of thing. This is one of the parts of one side of the walls of Han Chang'an in front of us, one of the better preserved sections of the walls. And when we ask, well, on the one hand, we unmistakably identify it as a rammed earth wall because it has a very specific stratigraphic presence. It's unmistakable once you've come to realize what it is. It's layer upon layer, discrete layers, then closely compacted together, all by human endeavor, by the way, which means in many cases, hundreds of thousands of people engaged in this task of reforming virtual stone from the loose soil around it. Well, what happens when dynasties fall is the local farmers in the area go, hey, this is great to basically take a slice of and make it the cornerstones for my far more humble house. And so what we have is 2 millennia here of farmers. This site was protected pretty late. It's saying 1961, if I can squint and see it correctly. And so that's what happens wherever we've got earthen walls. It's less, you would think it's erosion, it's less erosion than man-made attempts to take this product, which is incredibly labor intensive to produce, for one's own dwellings.
So you're saying this is this a western part of the Great Wall? Is it considered part of this system?
Sorry, no, I was jumping from the Great Wall because so many people know that, but that also would have been out of rammed earth. So built very much the same way. And all of these walls originally would have had brick facing. Okay. And the bricks, of course, were the first thing to go. But things follow after that with surprising speed unless prevented by the local authorities. So this is the biggest section of the city wall that we have in Han Chang'an. And over on your right, that's the biggest, no, not the biggest, the biggest palace, the Weihang Palace, a section of the drains that have been uncovered for the palace. Basically, this is unlike Rome. I'm a frequent visitor to Rome, and you can go to churches where you see subterranean churches, and you get a sense of which part of the city belongs to which era down through the centuries. In Chang'an, we're totally dependent on archaeological work for our reconstructions because the tombs is where we're getting our manuscripts and luxury items from. The imperial tombs, we believe, all were looted, so we're not so interested in imperial tombs, but we are quite interested in high-ranking officials and what would have been crammed in their tombs because those came from imperial workshops. Otherwise, we have had to do this kind of reconstruction period by period over the last, let's say 20, 30 years. So we have built up a density of knowledge about this city that's now pretty comparable to what Roman archaeologists have for their city. It's been done almost entirely through archaeology.
I see. Well, we just have a few minutes left. I understand there's that you say it's done through archaeology. Is that through the stratigraphy that's evident?
It's not just through the stratigraphy, it's through excavated texts, of which we're finding an abundance in tombs. Putting tomb manuscripts seems to have been the way you identified yourself as a high-ranking official. And the tombs include everything from poetry to legal case books. It's a huge range of things, medical textbooks, all kinds of things. It's partly this hard work in doing the stratigraphy, but once, because like every modern city, it's elevated above what would have been the level of the early city, just because of all the detritus of people over centuries. We actually have murals from the palaces, not complete ones, but fragments from the murals. So we are able to tell all kinds of things. We know how the outside was painted, for example. So we have, by all kinds of analysis, plant, pollen, mineral analysis, reconstructed the life of the people in the city. And what we had before we began this work was an incredibly dense quantity of writings in the received tradition, texts that had just come down through the ages about this area, simply because it was the capital. And so many things were produced by the elites that converged on this capital. That said, let me point out something that's pretty astonishing. When we compare Rome and China, Rome is really the only game in town. Alexandria close at one point and then not close at all. When we're in China, we have about 10 sites that we think were nearly as large as Western Han Chang'an.
Wow.
Yeah.
Second tier cities.
In theory, by the imperial hierarchy, second tier cities, but they predate the imperial period, and they were the old capitals of the kingdoms. And so there's still the transportation and economic hubs for the empire and its economy. And there is no question, I think everyone agrees, that the Western Han capital, and indeed the entire empire, was the richest empire in the world, and the richest empire anyone would see for a very long time.
Yeah. Well, this has been fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the questions.
Yeah, we had one last question before we wrap up, and that is, how is modern building impacting the archaeology of Chang'an?
Yeah. If it's an extremely important site, building will halt. But so many important sites have already been essentially destroyed. The site of one of the imperial mausoleum towns, and what I mean by towns is many officials would have been received the honor to live in a town around that mausoleum. It was a brick factory. And basically they were using this very high quality stuff to make very good bricks out of, and doing a bang up business. Even when the brick factory was shut down, there's been no one quite knows what to do with this site now. It's mostly destroyed.
Yeah.
What happens, on the one hand, modern building is a boon to Chinese archaeology because there were no basements in China. And so the minute you have to do anything below ground, you are getting to a lot of tombs. But of course, that's also the bane. I asked one of my close collaborators in Chang'an, well, how many tombs did you excavate this year? He said over 2,000.
Oh
I said, what does excavation mean? He said, in that case, we open it up, look and see if there's anything that right off, we've got an hour to make a decision. We want to take out of the tomb.
Yeah.
And then we're going to put the earth back and hope that when things calm down, there will be a time that when we can come back to this.
Oh boy. Yeah.
So anyway, this is very much a kind of salvage archaeology, which is not to say that the archaeologists in Qian are not first-rate archaeologists. They are the only national level archaeologists outside Beijing. So important is this site. And they've been really well trained internationally. They are first rate, they know everything. But they frequently are just rearranging all of their schedules because something has come to their attention and it needs to be dealt with now.
Urgently, I see.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much, Professor Nylan. This has been wonderful.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I enjoyed it. I hope people will be more interested in Chang'an going forward. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So thank you to the listeners and viewers and to the people who sent in questions. And I would like to invite the viewers to come back tomorrow at 11 a.m. to hear Lisa Pirrucini present on examining Etruscan eggs, life and afterlife, and funerary meals.
I'll be there.
All right.
I've written on dining in death. I think it's fascinating.
Wonderful. Bye-bye.
Bye.